Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm honoured to be speaking with Suze Burton-Wylie. Suze, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me on.
Super excited to have you on. Really looking forward to having a chat over the next hour or so. Why don't we start by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
No problem. So, as you said, Suze Burton-Wylie. I'm a performance psychologist at the English Institute of Sport, and I work with the British sailing team down in Weymouth.
Cool. How long have you been a performance psychologist for?
Yeah, I'm relatively new actually. I changed career quite late on. So I've been working with British sailing for 2 years, and I suppose prior to that, I'm still doing my professional doctorate at the University of Portsmouth, and so I was doing that for a year before I moved into my sailing role. So it's a dual research and applied role at the moment.
Okay, and so obviously you're doing a professional doctorate, and that's not in a specific area. That's sort of multiple areas multiple challenges that you come across, and you're just documenting those things and exploring and sense making and finding solutions. Is that kind of how that works for you?
So the professional doctorate is it's actually a mix of applied. So it's the applied version of a PhD.
Yeah.
So part of my thesis when I hand it in will be applied hours, covering a range of kind of key areas of performance psychology in that applied setting. But then equally there are research elements and case studies and things like that I need to report on. And in terms of my research area as a general kind of broad term, it's around organisational culture in sport.
Around organisational culture in sport, which is something that we want to dive into today. But I've never worked as a sports psychologist. I've never worked with a sailor. It's one of the few sports I've actually never had the pleasure of working in. And I popped on. I for one, being a fan. Clearly being a fan of the Olympics, as we all are, and being English and a supporter of the British team, popped onto the website, and I know how much success we've had historically in sailing, but I didn't know that, well, essentially we've been the most successful team globally. If you pop on there, you can see it actually says Team GB have topped the medal sailing table at 4 of the last 5 Olympic Games. And no sailor has won more medals than Sir Ben Ainslie, who's won 4 golds and 1 silver to his name. So, Suze, I know you've only been in there for a couple of years, but I'd be fascinated to learn a little bit about what you experience in there. How comes we are so good at sailing? When I say we, British, why are we so good at sailing?
Yeah, well, like you said, I can't talk for the years before I was there, but
Sure.
for me, without a doubt, there's a great setup in terms of the sports science and medicine team, and I may be a little bit biased because that's obviously where I fall. But I think ultimately, when it comes to the management, to the so the current PD, and Walker was an ex-medalist or medalist at the Olympics himself. I think there's a huge passion for the sport. You can it is such a unique sport that you can't do it easily. It's an expensive sport as well, so you have to have a genuine passion for the sport. So I think that's where it starts, if I'm honest. And then of course there's that passion leads into just striving, just wanting to get out on the water, wanting to be the best sailor they can be, challenging each other as well. The nature of sailing means that only one sailor or one boat per class can go. So you may have 2 boats in the top 5 in the world, but only one of them can go to the games. So there's a constant drive to push yourself and pushing each other as well. And then in terms of the psychology of sailing, it's very unique, as I say, but there's a huge element around decision making and having to make logical decisions on the water. If you think you've got the wind is changing all the time, you can be in one venue and the course is very different from one day to the next due to the weather conditions, the tidal, and the sea state and things like that. So you're constantly having to process all of that information and then to make decisions on the water and then, of course, execute it as well. So a big thing that we do in terms of underpinning the psychological support that we work with the sailors and support the sailors and coaches is around understanding thoughts, habits, and processes to help make those logical decisions. And then how we kind of back that up is how they understand themselves and others to build those relationships to create those high functioning teams. Because again, certain boats are single handed, so there's just one of them out on the water, one sailor. Others are double handed boats, so it's that constant communication with your teammate on the water as well.
So there feels like there's a real self-awareness piece there, a social intelligence as well, understanding self, understanding others, which drive or sit alongside the idea of reflecting on thoughts, building great habits, putting in effective and optimal processes to be able to be clear-minded out there on the water.
Absolutely, yeah, that's exactly it. And also to be able to reset. So one bad mistake on the water could mean a huge difference in places. And again, with sailing, once you're out at the front, it's easier to stay there because everyone else is battling for clean air, clean wind. So at the back. So you really want to try and make any mistakes that you do make, because we're human. You want to be able to effectively reset very quickly to make sure that you make the next decision count.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like there's a real race to get out front. So does quite a lot of the pre-race stress revolve around what have I got to do to get out front? What am I going to do if I'm not out front? Are those some of the conversations that you're having with some of the sailors?
Yeah, so a huge part of sailing actually is the starting.
Okay.
Probably makes sense with kind of what I've just said. So I know that the sailors and the coaches are very much prior to the race starting. They have a lot of time to think about it as well, of course, but launching, getting out to the start line, is understanding their strategy for the race that day. And what start do they need to try and do? Do they need to battle with the other boats, or can they be a little bit further down the line that might not be as so the line can be biased due to the wind moving the lines and the mark, and where the wind is. So they have to make the decisions around what position they start in as well.
So as part of your role there to facilitate conversation between the sailors and the coaches, in terms of strategy?
For me personally, I probably wouldn't say I do that, no. Because I can't. I'm not a sailor myself. So, in terms of the strategy conversations do go on. Of course, they do. All sailors will have that. But I think the bit that we focus on is how you build creating relationships, effective relationships between coach and athlete on the water. So what needs to happen there to make sure that when it comes to being on the water in those important moments, and in training, because of course they're important moments too, where's the synergy, I suppose, between them? Where's the ability to be the coaching ability and things like that, and just being able to help facilitate that. And then as a wider piece, it's that environment piece around the right challenge and support for growth, for that pursuit of growth.
You use that word challenge. I've noticed that I actually noticed on YouTube you've got really, really interesting. There's a really interesting conversation between you and one of the sailors. That your frame of reference is using the challenge and threat states theory. Is that something that as a practitioner you utilize?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, if you go back to the logical decisions under pressure is what sailors need to do. As anyone knows who plays sport, and actually going for an interview, doing this podcast today, there's always going to be elements of nerves, and because you care about an outcome. So for me, it's not trying to remove that pressure, because it's actually, you can use it. It's about seeing it as a challenge, rather than a threat. So instead of being in that emotional brain of fear, fight, flight, freeze, it goes into that logical brain of actually, what do I need to do today? This is a challenge, and what do I need to do to succeed? And I use ACT as well as my method of framework in terms of we can't always change thoughts. It's actually accepting them and still being able to continue regardless of what noise is going on in competition.
Well, I mean, for anybody listening in who's interested in challenge and threat state, I spoke with Dr. Joe Dixon, episode 111. He uses that at Stoke City Football Club and Bath Rugby Club. Episode 71, Dr. Jamie Barker, who does a lot of research into challenge and threat states, and also episode 80, Dr. Paul McCarthy. And episode 62 with Dr. Carla Mayen, who was one of the original researchers when it came to challenge and threat states. And interesting that you use ACT. So would that be your very much your philosophy around thoughts, that you wouldn't necessarily want sailors to actively, directively try to suppress thoughts? It's more allow sailors to experience thoughts, but turn down the volume of their importance. These thoughts, I'm going to have these, but I'm not going to allow them to affect me. Would that be kind of your philosophy there?
Yeah, that's spot on. I go back again, and I can't change all of my thoughts. So I think sometimes it's, if you battle with that, if you fight with that negative thought or that perception of threat, then it's a bit like the Chinese finger trap or quicksand, or all of these metaphors that ACT use, that you're then in a battle and you can't, and it takes you down a spiral, and before you know it, there's so much noise that you're not in a position to be able to really effectively kind of perform in the moment, having a clear mind for those logical decisions. So what ACT says is that if you can actually just acknowledge them, experience them, notice them, instead of trying to push them away, you can almost then let them go. And so, okay, I know you're there, but I know it's for a good reason, and use those nerves that you get in that moment for performance and for making the right decision.
It's interesting, as you were speaking there, I was thinking about ironic processing theory, Daniel Wegner's very popular theory. Don't think of I think he had a polar bear, but that classic "don't think of a pink elephant." Immediately you're going to think about it. So potentially, the more you try to push back those thoughts or suppress those thoughts, the more they actually come into conscious awareness. So what I hear you say is actually, okay, I'm having these thoughts, and that's fine. I'm going to use them to energize me. I've got them there for a reason. They're energizing me. They're helping me feel ready. These are here to help me feel ready, and so I'm going to utilize them to actually help me in this situation. Or I'm just going to ignore them and get on with my activities, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about trying to change them. It's about noticing them and then letting them go. And you've just summarised it very clearly there.
Your professional doctorate is based around, as you said, organisational culture. So I'd really like to talk about organisational culture. I mean, just dwelling on the British sailing before we go on to other stuff. Do you do much work there from an organisational cultural perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the direction of where I see, and not just myself, many others, but with sports psychology, is we really do want to be trying to work at that systemic level, because there's so much that you can help to support, and I wouldn't say we're responsible for influencing as such, but it's that kind of thing. Is actually there is more that we can do than just working at a one-to-one level, especially in organisational sport, where you've got management and you've got coaches and you've got support staff and you've got the athletes themselves. Naturally, there are differences that fall in any sport when you've got so many different people. So I think, in fact, culture is really everyone's business. because everyone, in my mind, it is the culture, or is part of the culture.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really pertinent thing to say. With that in mind, how do you define organisational culture, Suze?
Yeah, so even that is slightly contested.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if I go back, so organisational culture, the main definition
Mm,
that is used in sport
yep.
is typically that all culture is generally in sport is characterized by meanings, values, and symbols. It's the things that are shared by the members of the organisation, and it's underpinned by an organisational vision that
Mm,
guides those members. So that's generally the definition within sport, and I think there's a bit of a caveat there in that organisational cultural research has been around for many years. Edgar Schein was organisational culture, and then Matt Salverson brought that into sport in late
mm,
90s, early 2000s. But typically, it hasn't been. It's not been typically. It's not researchers haven't really adopted it that much. That's not to say there isn't
yep.
research out there, but it's not. It's not been used that much in terms of over the last 20 years. So the main time where it's been used the most is actually in sports management. So or researchers have tended to look at organizational culture in sports management, and that's the general consensus of the definition, that it's characterized by meanings, values, and symbols which are shared. And then from a sport perspective, of course, it's then trying to create operational effectiveness, financial success, and performance on the pitch, or I say pitch, golf course, on the water, whatever sport you're looking at. I don't know if that's probably quite confusing in itself. So hopefully that's helped a little bit in terms of the definition of culture that's out there at the moment.
Yeah, it definitely has, and I don't mind this word confusing because
Mm-hmm.
I think it is complex, and
Mm-hmm.
I have some in my own mind some challenges around this, Suze, and I think that certainly, as you say, it's something that I think we we perhaps struggle with, and I know you've done some work alongside Professor Chris Wagstaff on this, and one particular paper you've sent me through that highlights the complexity of organizational culture. I think the popular consensus, and please come back at me if you feel I'm going down the wrong path here, but the popular consensus is using this word shared. Right, you
Mm-hmm.
use this word shared, meanings and symbols and narrative, if you like, and values, identity, but shared. And this is potentially where we get ourselves into trouble, because my understanding is we can go off in two directions here. Um, One way to distinguish organizational culture is to describe it as something that an organization has. Another way
Mm-hmm.
to conceive culture is something that organizations are. So it's something that an organization
Mm-hmm.
has. We have a culture, and we are going to
Mm-hmm.
use this culture, as you mentioned earlier, to drive winning, to drive financial success, to drive our team forward, to bring everybody together. An alternative way, and I think a way that I'm becoming quite fond of looking at this, but isn't necessarily out there from a popular
Mm-hmm.
perspective within the public domain, is something that we are. That it's not something to be manipulated to gain success, but just culture's there. It just
Mm-hmm.
is what it is. We've just got to pay attention to it. And I'd love to unpack that, if that's okay with you. Something that organizations have
Mm-hmm.
versus something that organizations are. what I've said, am I on the right track there in terms of there's two ways of looking at organisational culture?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And like you say, the reference in the paper that I sent through is essentially saying exactly that. And the paper I sent through, of course, is a review of researchers and papers over the last 25 years.
Yeah.
So, and typically, or the majority of papers in looking at organisational culture in sport, like I say, mainly through sport management, not completely, but mainly.
Okay.
The predominant view is the organisation. It's something. Culture is something that an organisation has or have.
Mm.
And like you said, that's where you almost see the organisation has this culture, typically emphasised through values and norms. And whenever trying to change that culture or look at that culture, you see it as a variable that can be manipulated. So if we change X, does this improve Y?
Yeah.
When it comes to organisational culture, and it's looking around at the relationship between that element of culture and the outcomes on effectiveness, performance, efficiency, and productivity. Of course, that being typically is a leader-led view of culture as well. So it essentially kind of says, well, an organisation has leaders, senior management. They create a vision. They create some organisational values, and then the members of that organisation, of that team, will align to those, and we will have relative success, performance, productivity, effectiveness. And if things start to reduce in those areas, what can we change of our culture to make it better? Now, the strengths in that, of course, are that it's easy, or the easiest level of culture to see. Somebody external and someone internally can look at those values and speak to management, and it's something that is easier to kind of try and manipulate.
Yeah.
So that's probably why a lot of the sport management research look at that, because it's sport management and it's the easiest level or easiest layer of culture to review. The downside of that, of course, is that what about all of the other voices in that organisation? You're assuming that everybody thinks the same or is comfortable in following those shared values. And in reality, that's not the case. Everybody is different. Everybody has their own past experiences and views on to bring into this organisation, but also their own views and their own thoughts, their own cultural backgrounds. And so that's the challenge, because you may not get buy-in from other members of the organisation, such as coaches, support staff, and the athletes themselves. And so then it creates disagreements, and then we know that that's when problems start to manifest in that team, when people disagree with things that management are trying to put on them. But I will just say that doesn't mean that organisational values and vision isn't important. It's still really important to have that. But if that's people need something to latch onto, some guiding principles of where that organisation wants to go, and being clearly communicated by leaders helps create trust. But to only pin culture on that is ignoring the voices of everybody else.
Right. What you said at the end there is really interesting, and I'm gonna latch onto that. But I just want to summarise what I've heard you say there, because I think this is so important. I think what I love what you've done there is you've articulated it in a very simple way, and I'm going to reflect back what I hear, and again I'm reflecting back. We're speaking in super simple tones, but I think that's important. That if we've got an organisation, a leader comes into, in terms of defining culture as something that organizations have, it's leader driven. A leader comes in and creates cultural values and cultural behavioral norms. So they have a vision, they create these values, they create these behavioral norms as an extension of the values, or driving the values, or underpinning the values, or in fact what the values underpin. And they want every member of their mini community to align themselves with these values and these behavioral norms. And what I'm hearing you say is that this is really nice and neat, because this is it. What appears to be very, very simple. It's leader driven. The leader is saying, this is what we want. This is a direction. This is the best way we're going to be successful from a performance perspective. If we're talking about sports, it's the best way we're going to drive everybody's game forward, win the trophy, etc., etc. But what I hear you say as well is the disadvantage is that we're not necessarily taking into account individual differences. We're not concerning ourselves with perhaps, I've heard of this word contestation, which is a posh term for the value of conflict and differences of opinions, and actually uncertainty, the value of uncertainty. But very much drawing on this notion of everybody's an individual and everybody's different. And it's pretty naive to think that everybody can simply align themselves with this set of 5 values. Does that neatly sum up that definition of organisational culture?
It does indeed. Yeah, sums it up perfectly there, Dan.
And I suppose there's some other things at play here. I suppose there's other things in terms of this is about increasing compliance, reducing resistance, and I'm guessing that players, staff can comply outwardly, but inwardly they might be quite ambivalent. So leaders might think, oh, wow, yes, this person is complying to these 5 values, if we were to put it in very simple words. But actually, inwardly, that player or the players or members of staff might be saying, well, you know what, I'm just going to comply, but I'm not really that interested, or I don't actually agree with that. There's not actual real buy-in. They might just play the part, but they don't actually live the part. So we don't fully know. It's not easy to grasp the evidence that our culture, these norms and these values are actually working.
Correct.
So, and then finally, these might be problems, but we still need to have a direction. So we don't want to get rid of these values completely.
Yeah, not at all. We need something, or an organisation needs something. You need something that's shared. To provide that direction and to almost form the basis of meaning. But it's, like I said, and like you've summarised perfectly, that can't be it. There needs to be more consideration.
So let's explore the other type of culture, and then we might shift between the two. To move the conversation forward. What is it when we conceive culture as something that organisations are? What does that mean?
So it means that everybody within that organisation is part of the culture, and so within that you've got your subgroups or your subcultures. Yep. So even at sailing, we've got sports science and medicine team.
Yep.
We're one subculture. We've got coaches, they're another. We've got athletes, we've got management. We've even got the athletes going to Tokyo and the athletes going for Paris. They're all subcultures, but we still have we're all part of the British sailing team. And so, but everyone's experiences, the way that people view the world, their perceptions, we're all very different. All of that creates part of the culture, because people bring in their stories, people bring in the identities that they have and form part of that culture. And so the voices that they have need to be considered when you try to understand an organisation's culture.
So it feels like that in this instance, the culture is there. I'm not going to use it as a tool to be able to manipulate anything.
Mhm.
I'm not necessarily going to create values and norms. The values and norms are out there. They're just different. They're disparate between individuals, between departments. And my job as a leader is just to make sense, to sense make around those differences between individuals and between groups.
Yeah, I think yeah, you use sense making then. That is or makes sense, and that is a very key part of it. But you also mentioned something else about leaders. I think one of the strengths is that if, as a leader, you can understand that culture is actually so complex and isn't something that you can manipulate like a variable, but rather, and actually, we
Yep.
may never have this perfect culture in an organization because it's so dynamic and it's constantly changing, and there's so many different parts to it that it's almost a case of what's important to us as an organization and how do we build that from the bottom, so how do we get everybody involved in creating that, but just being aware that it's dynamic and it's constantly changing, and being okay with that. It's almost about accepting that, I think, and not trying to get people to conform to a set way of shared meaning. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Dan. Sorry.
Yeah, what I hear you say is it's understanding what's important to us and appreciating individual and group
Mm.
differences, appreciating that homogeneity. I mean, and this feels like a limitation when we consider culture as something that organizations have. That homogeneity just isn't possible. Not it seems nonsensical that we can drive people to be
Mm.
the same or groups to be the same, and that might even work. Even you mentioned sports scientists, sports psychologists and sports scientists. In my experience, tend to take different worldviews, neither of which are wrong. They just have different worldviews from a very basic perspective, with different views of how one treats data, for example,
Mm.
of how one should go about their working practices. And it's not that these are wrong. It's
Mhm.
just really we have to if we want to get from point A to point B. It's more about appreciating those individual differences and working our coaching practices around those differences.
Yeah, yeah. I think you just made a point. You can have subcultures within subcultures. Exactly. It's about understanding differences from a coach's perspective. Um, it's understanding that within your team, within your squad, um, it, there are so many differences with the individuals that are in that squad.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean you can't try to create a shared consensus of the teams. How do we want to be as a squad? What are the behaviours we want to demonstrate? What do we how do we want to, when we turn up to an away game, how do we want to be perceived by others? You can still have that, and that actually creates that identity as a team. You don't want to lose that, but to create that, you want everyone involved. You want everyone involved to put their kind of ideas in, so they can start to create the meaning for themselves. So they can feel part of the creation of the squad, and they identify with it. Um, and that doesn't mean you're not still following the vision of the wider organisation, but you've created your own little team culture in your subgroup of what really matters to you, and what your why is. I think that's really important. Like, what's our why as a team? What's our vision as an under 23s, for example, or an under 18s in football?
So what you've said there has made me reflect on something. I would go back to episode 37 of the Sports Psych Show, speaking to Dr. Andrea First, who was sports psychologist for the British women's hockey team who won gold in Rio. And she mentioned
Mm-hmm.
spending a good 12 hours obviously not 12 hours non-stop, but an hour here, an hour there, with the team working on their values. And what it makes me think, as you're saying there, is it's not that we don't want to work on values and behavioural norms. It's just appreciating individual differences around those values and behavioural norms, and spending the time to help every single person, every key stakeholder, whether players or members of staff, to be able to understand, to grasp their differences away from those values, that how they might treat those values, how they might bear relationship with those values. And it strikes me that, I mean, we didn't go into too much detail as to what Andrea did, but I'm sure a great deal of time was spent working with individuals to appreciate how they fit into those values. And so if we're going to do that exercise, we've got to do it properly. We've got to spend time. It can't just be 1 hour, get our values, we put it up on some posters, and then they're not referred to again. We've got to appreciate individual differences to be able to bring them into those values.
Yeah, exactly. So they're not just words on the wall. Exactly that. So if we let's take a squad as an example, from a football team that have got multiple squads at different age groups. As a coach of one of those squads, absolutely an hour on values isn't enough. There's the whole process of trying to support those athletes or those players understanding what those values are. It takes time, and there's lots of different exercises out there online that you can use to help with that. And including, I think I mentioned before, what is your why? Simon Sinek on YouTube has got lots of material on that. And it really helps. You know, we all know what we do and how we do it, but sometimes do we know why we do it? And so having that why really helps with the motivation side of things. And, you know, when times get tough, you know why you're doing it. But if you can align your why and your individual values, all of a sudden you can start to create a bit of a squad charter almost. You know, who do we want to be as a squad? What are our values as a squad? And this is our subculture, and this is what we're about. And then I've done work in the past where you then take those values that you've created as a squad and start to say, okay, well, how do they align to the organisational values? And then, you know, someone from management can come into this youth or junior squad, and in their own way, they can see that these values are being lived, but instead of being enforced or assumed that they're shared, they've been created by the individuals themselves, by those athletes themselves.
Yeah, I love that. And as you're speaking, I'm reflecting on some of my experiences as well. And I think I've just written down the word compete, because there's definitely groups, teams out there that would have the word, say, compete within their list of values. And we can consider the behavioral norms around compete. But I think values with relationship to behavioral norms is an interesting phenomenon. And this is perhaps the challenge around values is when we have a value word like compete. Well, compete can mean different things to different people. So, for instance, I had one scenario where a coach was pretty miffed that a certain player wasn't competing in the way that coach felt that he should be competing. And his view of competing was 100% intensity and dead serious, and a overwhelming focus on the task at hand. Whereas this player felt that he competed best in more of a joyful, playful state, that he experienced high performance when he almost felt like he was going out and playing with his friends.
Yeah.
And so there's almost like a conflict there. And it feels like the conversation needs to happen whereby a coach is more open-minded about that kind of individual difference within that word compete, within any value-driven word, essentially.
Yeah, and I know that you've, in a previous episode, chatted with Professor Stephen Wolnick, and it's exactly that, the motivational interviewing. It's, as a coach, try and understand the athletes or the football players' perspective, because then all of a sudden you've got their meaning. You're not trying to give your meaning as a coach. You're not trying to apply your meaning to that player. Which is called sense giving. You're actually trying to understand from the individual's perspective, and then all of a sudden that changes from this athlete or this football player isn't doing what I'd like to do, or to actually their behaviours are in context with how they see compete, or how they feel compete should be demonstrated. And then of course you get, hopefully there's a lot less conflict, there's more synergy in terms of moving forward with that player in particular. And then we know that if you've got the synergy there with one player, if you can do that with every player, and I know it's not easy, culture is, I know that's not easy, but you then get this more cohesive squad, and everyone feels that they're being able to live to their values, and enjoyment is key as well. Let's not take away the enjoyment side. We all start playing sport because we enjoy it, and so it just helps massively in the wider picture.
You said something really interesting there, sense giving. It feels like that center ground between culture as something that organizations have and culture as something that organizations are lies in the skill of balancing sense giving and sense making.
Yeah, I'd say that's a very good spot, and
yeah, a useful sweet spot.
yeah, but that's exactly it, and it goes back to that transformational leadership, that kind of the leaders that are aware. They've got that, they're able to clearly articulate their sense giving, and not just leaders, coaches as well. Because everyone needs direction. It goes back to everyone needs a little bit of vision and direction, but are able to really balance very well that fine line of this is what we need to try and be shared, but equally, how do you make sense of it? How do you make sense of this world that we're in this organisation, and how best can we support that for growth? So for motivation, enjoyment, success, which as you go up the chain leads to financial success as well.
In transformational coaching, you've got to do the hard graft, haven't you? You can't just do that group in front of you session, create those 5 values, talk a little bit about behavioral norms that surround those values, and away you go, and we print some posters and everything's hunky-dory. You've got to do the hard graft. You've got to have those individual conversations. You've got to sense make within those individual conversations the things that players find easy about aligning with the values, and the things that perhaps don't quite align with their own values, essentially, and being able to create a safe space there, giving them the psychological safety to express what they struggle to align with, and then negotiating, coming up with solutions there, I suppose, and bringing those values out onto the training ground. It's that transformational leadership piece it's tough. It's challenging for leaders to be transformational leaders.
It is tough. It's not. If it was easy, then I don't think that this word organisational culture or culture in sport would be it's a buzzword at the moment, isn't it, with everything that's going on. It is tough, but like I said, culture isn't easy, and culture, I don't think would ever. If you got to a place where you were 100% happy with your culture, then I think you need to bottle that and sell it. But it's the hard graft, but it's understanding that everyone is different and has their own view. That's not to say that people can't be challenged, and behaviours should be or negative behaviours or behaviours that aren't aligned with the squad values that you've created shouldn't be challenged, and appropriately, of course. But even that has there's work that's happened in the past around you get the players to create their own consequences, so you almost have a reasonable response to a specific behaviour. So as a squad, you've decided that no mobile phones when training starts. A player is on the mobile phone. What's a reasonable response to that? As a squad, create that reasonable response so you're able to hold up the mirror and check and challenge appropriately. So it's not about taking into the consideration of individual differences so strongly that basically people just do what they want. It's still about creating this alignment of where we need to go and what direction we want to go in, but it's having the voices that are in that squad creating that.
I see what you're saying there. So again, going back to my simplistic version of this, if we've got a leader who's driving values and norms and is sense giving and sense making, part of this is also, you use this term consequence. Part of this is empowering. Some people don't like that word, and I appreciate that, but empowering players to come up with their own consequences for not aligning themselves with the behavioural norms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly that. And you tend to, it goes back to that buy-in, doesn't it? It goes back to, if you've got a coach while you're on your phone, it becomes that very parent-child relationship of, oh, don't tell me what to do. But if you've created that as a squad, oh, hang on, you were part of the creation of this. So, there's that ability to check and challenge and having a foundation to do that appropriately.
I love that. I love that term, check and challenge. I love that term, check and challenge, for coaches. I assume there you mean to check in with a player and to challenge them accordingly and appropriately.
Yeah, I do. And again, it goes back to that culture is everyone's business. So equally, the players can check and challenge their kind of teammate as well. It gives them that platform to do that, again, appropriately in the right way.
And again, drawing from you, I love that term, culture is everyone's business. And I think that in itself is the coaches and the leaders' challenge, isn't it? To make it everybody's business. But you don't just make it everybody's business by insisting. It's that classic term, insistence leads to resistance. It's again coming back to sense giving and sense making, to be able to make sure that culture becomes everyone's business. It's a skill. It's a leadership skill in itself, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So from the management with coaches as well, and again, it's not easy, but it can seem a bit overwhelming. So you can, there's you can start at little places. You don't have to go fully in. Right, what are we trying to understand here? What are we trying to try and influence? You can actually, there's so many different layers to culture that you can start off, bite-sized chunks and start to see where that goes. So in terms of those levels, you can, you've got the artifacts of what you can visibly see. They're a lot easier. The dress, so one of those, what do we want as a squad? Well, we all need to turn up in team kit. Something quite simple, really, but can have its challenges if people don't want to. But also understanding if someone isn't turning up in team kit, why is that? Rather than just blanket across the squad. And then you go into values that we've talked about. And then you've got underlying assumptions, which is the real core of culture, which takes a long time to understand, and probably why it's the least research, because you have to embed yourself in that environment for a long time to understand what those underlying assumptions are. And by underlying assumption, I mean those things that actually you just take for granted. They're part of the fabric, I suppose, and it's through this. It's through kind of it can be the beliefs of the squad, what we do around here, that kind of thing. And that's not easy to kind of get into. But when you start to realize that culture or organizational culture can be layered and can come out in the stories that people tell, or the myths, or even the humor, within, or the practice, the rituals, the ceremonies that you have at the beginning of training or after training, that all forms part of, your culture and your squad culture. And as a leader, if you can start to understand that and understand how everyone's sense making is in that, and then going down when people are at conflict with that and trying to understand it rather than trying to force it, really starts to help change that, or influence, not change, but influence the culture with everyone's buy-in, with everyone's voice being heard, so everyone's responsibility.
Drawing from what you said there, I love that notion of organisational culture is layered. And in many respects, it's our duty to try to understand it. It's layered from artifacts, basic behaviours such as what we wear, what we do around, say, the training ground, the stadium, the pitch, the field, down to those values, the assumptions, the beliefs, the identities, the personality variables. And the term I was thinking of as you were speaking there is a psychologically informed environment. To be able to understand it, we need to have, as coaches, better conversations within departments and across departments, perhaps, to be able to make sense, to understand, to understand it. Psychologically informed environment feels to me something that can be a tool here that coaches can use. Just have better conversations about the people within your organisation.
Yeah. And with what you just said there, Dan, it reminds me of probably one of the first questions that you asked, mainly around my role at sailing. But do I have those conversations, or am I having those cultural conversations and doing cultural work within sailing? And I think that's it. When you break that down, it's supporting coaches and management to have those psychologically informed conversations. Or those supporting a psychologically informed environment for thriving. So those environments to thrive at high challenge, high support in the pursuit of growth, whilst also considering the whole person, which I think is really crucial. But yeah, it's those psychologically informed conversations for sure.
Yeah, and just to close here, I mean, as you were talking there, I was thinking of my conversations on and off air with Dr. Chris Shambrook, who came on way back in episode 2 of the Sports Site Show, and he's a veteran of 5 Olympic cycles with British rowing, another very successful British Olympic team, and he talks about almost the difference that makes the difference for us as sports psychologists, where we can offer real value to any organisation, is this psychologically informed environment. As you're doing there at British Sailing, is facilitating those conversations, promoting those conversations to be able to, let's bring it back to organisational culture, to be able to help coaches understand the layers of culture. And to be able to cross from sense giving to sense making and back again. No question there, but I just think dealing with this notion of, yes, we still have to we have to respect that we're not going to deal with homogeneity here. We're not going to deal with everybody being the same, but we still have to have meaning and direction. We still have to have values and behavioural norms. How do we do that? It's that subtle interplay between sense giving and sense making. And it's the capacity to deep dive from the artifacts down to the values and the beliefs. No question, just a thought.
I think you've summed it up very well there, Dan. And it sounds simple, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely, but as you say, difference between simple and easy, and I think I'm able to sum it up with more clarity for myself now, because you've helped me to do that, not just from your paper, but from mainly from what we've discussed today. I've really enjoyed that conversation because you've answered my questions, and it was an area I was confused about a little bit, I have to say, but that having this conversation has helped me understand that that yes, we can study culture as something that organizations have, and we can study culture as something that organizations are. It's about appreciating the strengths and limitations of both and trying to find that sweet spot. I suppose my final, very closed question would be, am I right about that? We're trying to find a sweet spot potentially between the two, take what's good from both and find that sweet spot.
Yes, you've summed that up.
Brilliant. Well, Suze, that's been awesome, and it's a complex topic, and it's difficult, it's challenging to talk about, and it's challenging to articulate. I know that would have tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience, who are probably filled with questions right now. How can they get hold of you? Are you on social media? How can they get in touch if they've got any questions or want to have a conversation with you?
Sure, thanks. So, I'm on Twitter. It's at SBW Sports Psych. And I've also got a website, which is sbwsportspsychology.co.uk.
Fantastic. Well, Suze, thank you so much for your time today and helping me to tackle that very complicated topic of organisational culture. Thanks for your time.
No, thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.